You're still there. I'm so sorry. I took off to go to the beach for a while. I didn't forget you. I just wanted to stay at the beach. But don't worry, we're just about done. I told you in the first video there's a total of 20 steps, but I ended up putting 3 steps into one for step 5. So we have step 16 and 17 up here, which if we wouldn't have put them together, we'd be up to step 19. I did that spur of the moment because it made a little bit more sense to me, but it might be easier if you label them all out up to 20. I hope that doesn't confuse you. So what I will do is I will probably put that in a description, I guess, if I put this on YouTube. But I wanted you to know that because otherwise I can come up with another way to get to 20, but it's more likely if you keep it how I originally numbered it in the videos, it would actually end up being 17 steps total. And let me explain why. Because we have remedies right now, and there's a remedy buyer, remedy seller. I labeled them 16, 17, but technically, if you have an issue with the buyer, you would do remedies for the buyer, and then the step 17 would be damages for the buyer, and vice versa, it was the seller. So the way I numbered it would actually be probably more like 17 steps, but you see, that's not a nice number. I like 20 steps better. Don't know if that's really helpful. I'm debating whether or not I should start this video over again. Don't think I'm going to. So, you got to listen to my little jabber. If you know me, I do that quite often. So, if you have a contract and there is a product that is being sold, right, we have to look at if there's an issue, like a breach of contract, or there's a problem with the warranty. It could be one of those things, right? So when you're looking at an issue with a buyer, say the buyer has a problem with the seller for some reason, there are certain remedies that the buyer actually has, and they're able to enforce certain things against the seller. So I'm going to generally go over what those remedies are for both sides and what would cause that remedy to be available for either side. And then after that, we're going to go into damage and break down each different types of damage and what the calculations are, because they're really fun and they're kind of a lot. So, what remedies does a buyer have? Well, first of all, they have remedies only if there's an issue with the seller. Now you're probably like, what issues would there be? Well, if the seller fails to deliver the product that was ordered, that's pretty easy. So if the seller fails to perform his end of the bargain, then there's going to be a remedy the buyer can take based on that. And there's also another one. If one party repudiates the contract, remember that means that they get out of the contract or they try to terminate the contract before they actually fulfill and perform on the contract, so they literally are repudiating. Then obviously you have if the buyer rejects, so they get the product and they say, nope, not going to accept it, they reject, there's still a remedy for the buyer. And there's also a remedy if the buyer had accepted and then later revokes his acceptance, right? So there's 4 potential things the seller could do or something that happens with the seller that would give rise to a remedy for the buyer. The seller never performs because they never delivered the product. The seller anticipatorily repudiates the contract. The buyer rejects the good because the seller sent him something that was incorrect or wrong or somehow defective. Or the buyer did accept but later revokes because he finds some type of material defect with what had been delivered. Now with that said, you're like, well, what remedies does the buyer have? So they have a few. The most common is going to be if the seller never actually, sent him the item that he needed. The seller did not send the product to the buyer. So what's the buyer to do? They need this product. It's very important to him. Maybe he's got a restaurant. If he has a restaurant, he needs his ingredients at a certain time so he can prep food. Otherwise, he can't sell anything and he can't make any money. So usually, in a situation like a food industry, it's very important that the seller performs on his contract and delivers. And if he doesn't, the buyer is going to have to find another way around that. He's going to have to figure out how can he fulfill this order with another supplier and do it as quickly as possible so he can still run his business. And so the remedy that a buyer could take is known as cover. So a cover is a remedy that a buyer has that allows them to essentially replace the item that he was supposed to get, that the seller was supposed to give him, in lieu of the original contract. So if I own a coffee shop and I ordered coffee beans from a local distributor and they failed to deliver it, and I am about to open up my shop in 2 days and I don't have any coffee beans, well crap, I need to figure out where to get these coffee beans. So I need to cover what I was gonna get. You're almost like, think of it like this, you're covering your hind, you're covering your butt because they weren't looking out for you. Now you're like, crap, I gotta go figure out what to do. I gotta cover myself, I gotta cover my assets. So what are you gonna do? You're gonna call frantically looking for a supplier that's able to deliver the coffee beans based on your needs. That's called a cover. Now, if you are able to satisfactorily cover what you needed, you can actually then pursue damages based on that, even if you've already replaced what the supplier was supposed to give you. And we'll get into that calculation later. But really what the cover allows you to do is potentially recover expenses that you incurred trying to cover this. And also you can allow you to recover the cost if it's more expensive. So if I ordered coffee beans from you 6 months ago, and a week before they're supposed to be delivered, you cancel on me, now I have to find a supplier within a week. Now I have to pay, say, cost to expedite the beans. That's an expense, and I would have never had to do that had you not failed me on delivering the beans. So that is what cover is. Now just know, when you are looking at any type of buyer remedy regarding cover, there is a standard that has to be applied. It's a very easy standard, and the standard is just commercial reasonableness. So if I need to replace the coffee beans that you failed to give me as the seller, I can go to some other supplier down the street, say that they have beans that are relatively the same type, they're around the same, flavor profile, and they're from the same country, and say there might be just a little bit more expensive, but they're generally about the same quality. That's considered commercially reasonable because I'm just replacing it with something that will work for, what the initial contract would have given me. So really what you just think about it like this is you're just trying to find a substitution. It doesn't have to be an inferior substitution. It just has to be something that if you use this instead of the other one, there's not going to be a substantial difference in the product. So for example, if anybody ever gone to Walmart, you might see, regular sour cream and Great Value sour cream. And the regular sour cream, let's just say it's a brand. And say you're originally going to get Great Value and they fail to deliver. So you had to get the brand sour cream. One might argue the brand has a better flavor profile, but the price is very similar. And the purpose of this was to make, some type of taco bar. You're substantially able to perform your original purpose because you're able to fulfill the order that you needed, and the item that you got was very similar to the other item, and even if it's a slightly more expensive, it's going to be considered commercially reasonable because you did what you had to do as a business owner. Now let's just say you go to the store and they have, they don't have the sour cream you originally had ordered, but they have, Dollop of Daisy, and then let's say they have another brand that's 7 times more expensive than Dollop of Daisy, but apparently it's made with the best ingredients in all the land, and it has the best flavor profile ever, and it's very rare and hard to find, and it always sells out because of this superior quality. If you as a business owner buy that instead, you will not be able to recover any damages under a remedy of cover because it's not commercially reasonable for you to get a brand or a product that is so far superior to what you would have originally gotten. And this kind of goes to the basic public policy of unjust enrichment, right? We're trying to make sure you get the benefit of your bargain. But we're not going to allow you to not only get the benefit of your bargain, but then get an additional bump up from what you would have gotten. So we increase your benefit, but then we're also going to take money from this other person. That's not really fair. And that's really the basic premise of it. Like, you're not allowed to recover with a superior product with superior ingredients if your original product that you were originally looking for and looking to buy and originally contracted for was of an average quality. So as long as it seems to be a fair substitution, then it's fine. But if it's not a fair substitution, it's not going to be found to be commercially reasonable. Now, there's another thing that you can do as a buyer. Now, if there is no delivery from the seller, you can also just recover damages, and we'll get into that calculation. So just so you're aware, there is no obligation for the buyer to cover. Like, there's no obligation for the buyer to go and protect their assets. There's no obligation for them to go and try and prevent a mishap because they didn't have this product. They're not obligated to do so. But it's probably best for their business if they do, but they're not obligated. They could just say, you didn't deliver, you didn't fulfill your end of the bargain, I'm going to sue you for damages, and that's totally fine. You're allowed to do that as a buyer. Now, there's two other things that you can do. There is a calculation for recovering certain damages if the other party breaches. So if a seller breaches, there are some basic recovery calculations that are available to the buyer depending on what stage of the contract they breached and what the breach was caused by. So if, for example, there's an anticipatory repudiation, that's usually going to be more likely to be the same as a basic recovery damage analysis. However, if they have to revoke acceptance, that's a different type of calculation. That's a different type of recovery because it's based on something that, had a material defect. So there are different calculations for different situations. So just be aware that they're slightly different. And the last one's obviously going to be specific performance. Specific performance doesn't really come up because it's just too easy. Specific performance is we want you to do what you were contracted to do. We're not going to let you get out of the contract. We're not going to let you just pay damages. We're actually going to require you to act. And that's typically going to be done in situations where the seller can't be replaced, the item can't be replaced because the seller has specific skills or the seller has specific talent, expertise, or the contract is for something like real property. It's something that cannot be replaced because it's so incredibly unique because, God only made so much land and all of that land is unique and different in its own special way. And there's also different situations where we're going to require specific performance if there wasn't like a good enough reason for the seller to breach, and it would probably put the other party in a worse position. There are just certain situations like that. And if specific performance is a remedy that the buyer seeks and they win, the court would just force the seller to do what they promised they were going to do. So as you can see, there's really not much analysis there, which is why it probably doesn't come up hardly at all. I wish it did. That'd be fun. That'd be easy. But specific performance doesn't usually come up, but it is a remedy that can be used. So if there's any type of like multiple choice question on it, can the court require a seller to perform on a contract that they tried to breach? If there's no unconscionability there, if there's no unfair bargaining power of any kind, and there's no impracticability that's being applied, then it's pretty likely if the buyer can make a good case that this is one of the only people that can do this thing, right? That's what you have to argue. So, those are the buyer remedies. Now, what is the remedy for a seller? So, it depends on what the buyer did, right? It's totally the same thing, but opposite side of the coin. And just so you're aware, there's actually less like damages and rights for sellers than there are buyers, and that's because most sellers are merchants and most buyers are not. It all goes back to the basic concept of economy. We want people to go out and buy things and contract and do these things, and non-merchants are not as knowledgeable of the law and of the Article 2 UCC, and they're not as knowledgeable about the ins and outs of it. So we hold merchants to a higher standard because we're saying, you know more, you should know better. And so that's kind of why, could be one of the many reasons obviously, why there are less remedies for sellers. And it's a little bit harder to get a remedy as a seller because you have to have better facts, like to be able to support like your claim. But as long as you point to facts, you do have remedies. We're not going to be high and dry, but it's just not going to be as many or as broad as a buyer would have. So when or what can a seller do? It depends on what the buyer does. So if the buyer rejects a item that was delivered and they do so wrongfully. Now remember, rejection can be done only if there's something actually wrong with the item. If it's a single transaction and based on the trilogy, there's nothing that could go into support otherwise. So it has to be a perfect tender. If it's not a perfect tender, it's a one-time transaction that trilogy can't help out, then okay, he can reject. But what if, it was an installment contract? They're not allowed to just reject. Like, they just can't. They have to work with the seller and there's a right to cure. In addition to that, an installment contract is an ongoing relationship that there you have multiple opportunities to conversate and fix this. And so You can't just say, this doesn't match exactly what I wanted. This perfect tender doesn't apply to an installment contract. So if they try to say, I'm rejecting based on perfect tender, that would be a wrongful rejected in an installment contract. In addition, we have wrongful revocation. Now, wrongful revocation is where you accept something and you take it back as a buyer, but you don't have a good reason to do so. So you can only revoke acceptance if there's a material defect of the product that you did not find upon doing your due diligence of an inspection, because the type of defect was not able to be, discovered, and you did not know, and there's no reason you could have known of this defect until you use a little bit more. But let's say you accept the product and you decide to revoke acceptance, not because of an actual defect, but you change your mind. That could be an example of a wrongful revocation because you have no grounds to revoke, right? Now, another way you can look at wrongful rejection is, what if I say I don't want this product anymore, and I tell you that, so I reject, but then I start using the product as if I accepted it, and I'm acting inconsistent with my rejection. That could be an example of a wrongful rejection because you're not actually rejecting, you didn't actually do so, and it won't be treated as a rejection because of that, because you are acting consistent with what you stated. So as a buyer, you have to have a reason to reject, and you have to treat the item as if you did in fact reject. You have to treat as you would expect somebody to. And you can't just revoke your acceptance unless you have a good faith basis in that there's a material defect. There's two other ones, okay? One is known as non-payment. So non-payment is very easy. I buy a product as a buyer and I don't pay. Or I have an installment contract and I'm supposed to pay a few dollars every single month, or $20 every single month, and I stop paying on my installment contract. If it's an ongoing contract, any type of non-payment allows the seller to respond based on their remedies that they have. And the last one is repudiation. Again, anticipatory repudiation, that's me as a buyer backing out of a deal before we have fulfilled either side. And essentially, I'm just trying to get out of the contract. And depending on what's happening, there are seller remedies for that. So those are things the buyer can do wrong. Now, what can the seller do if they do bad things? Obviously, the most common is they withhold the delivery or they stop it. That's very common with a non-payment, because obviously, why are you going to deliver something to somebody they're not paying? It's also common in installment contracts if the buyer, for whatever reason, starts to reject products based on the perfect tender rule that they're not allowed to use. And so what the seller might do is they might pause delivery until they resolve the problem, because it's very expensive to keep delivering things back and forth. The seller also is allowed to cancel the contract if the buyer is doing one of these things if they wanted to. So if a buyer, repudiates anticipatorily, like before the contract is fulfilled, the seller has the right to cancel it and to seek another buyer. And if they do that, this person can't come back and, say, oh, I changed my mind, because, they're allowed to respond to a repudiation by canceling the contract if they want. So, what else can the seller do? Obviously, if there's a rejection of revocation or a non-payment, or even a repudiation, any of those things, the seller has the right to resell those goods. Sometimes goods are specifically made for a buyer and they have a right to try and resell them. Sometimes a buyer stops paying, they have a right to resell them. A buyer rejects, they have a right to resell it. A buyer says that there's something actually wrong with it. The seller has a right to resell because they're trying to mitigate their risk. They don't always have to mitigate their risk, but the point is that they can. And they can recover damages. Usually the most common way is through resale. Now when you look at resale, there's two main types of resale. It's going to be a public sale or a private sale. Sorry. Now if it's a private sale, you have to, as a seller, give reasonable notice to the buyer. That's it. If I give you reasonable notice as a buyer that I'm going to try and resell this, you have fulfilled your obligation. If it's a public sale, there's a little bit more rules regarding it for a seller's remedy. First, you do have to give reasonable notice of the sale, where it's going to be, at what time, and it has to be enough so that they can respond if they want to show up. You can't give them notice day of, that's not considered reasonable. And the resale, the public resale for these items that you are deciding to sell that were specifically going to be sold to the buyer, specifically made to the buyer, whatever it was, you can't go set up an entire public sale and go and sell other things that you need to from other insolvent buyers. You can only take the items from that specific buyer and sell them. You cannot sell multiple things. And the rule is, if you're doing a public sale, to try to recover damages to resell them, which is your right as a buyer under your remedies, you can only sell previously identified goods that were for that buyer. If the goods were not previously set aside, identified, claimed for this buyer, labeled for this buyer, on the carrier to this buyer, already gone there and back, whatever, then you cannot sell it there because it's only supposed to be for that buyer's product that they somehow did not end up with. Now, in addition to that, the resale has to meet several qualifications. First of all, it has to be in good faith. So the seller has to act in good faith regarding all of their choices in this resale, where they choose to sell it, the time they choose to sell it, who they choose to sell it to. All that has to be considered in good faith, and it must be commercially reasonable. Is it reasonable to host a public auction in the middle of a club at 2 in the morning? No. Don't care who you are, no. Is it commercially reasonable to host a public sale to resell goods in the middle of a back alley? No. Is it commercially reasonable to rent a hotel space that's usually used for conferences at 10 o'clock in the morning to resell? Yes. Has to be something you would expect in a business setting. The trilogy can come in to help argue what commercial reasonableness is. But typically, your most basic thought when you think of a public sale or an auction, it should be something like that. It should be organized in a clean place, clean environment, documentation's there, stuff like that. Now, the commercial reasonableness has to also apply to the manner of which it is sold. That means the terms of the sale. So whoever shows up to this public auction, the terms of the sale must be reasonable, and the method. So if the terms of the sale is, I will pay $10,000 down and $5,000 on delivery, that's fine. If the method is, I would like to use the product first, and then I would like to lease it, that's not a sale, because there's no title transfer. That would not be considered a reasonable method, because that's not a method of sale. It has to be a method of sale. Lastly, the price is very interesting. So the price need not be what the buyer was going to pay. Need not be even the value that is the market price. It could even be 20% below. It could even be 50% below what it should have sold for. As long as as long as the seller can say that they tried to fetch a reasonably fair price for this item, it's fine. So what I mean by reasonable, if we're in the middle of winter and it's 2 days after Christmas, and typically the market is $20,000, but there's hardly any buyers because it's 2 days after the holidays and you have to get the sale done because you're really hurting to pay your creditors because you had to get all this money loaned to you to make this thing that this person doesn't want. If you have to sell it for $10,000 because you're up to your ears in hawk and there's something you can do, and you tried to advertise and you did advertise and you told everybody you had to tell, but you only made $10,000 and you're $10,000 short, that's going to be found to be reasonable. Why? Because you did everything you could, you acted in good faith, and you did what you had to do. Because remember, these remedies, it doesn't mean that as a seller, I have to take the short end of the stick. It just means that I have to try my best to act in good faith and to be commercially reasonable. Remember how we went over those pillars way earlier? What it means to be a buyer, what it means to be a seller, what it means to act in commercial reasonableness regarding the industry or trade. That applies to sellers and buyers throughout every single transaction, throughout every single analysis, and you can bring that in here. Because it is part of the analysis, but you can break it down further, and this seller was a merchant who had to clearly take out money. It is not reasonable for a merchant to have to insist on the highest price possible if they did everything they needed to do, they satisfied the standards to resell, they give everybody notice that they were required to give, And at the end of the day, the bill most they were able to make was this. They don't have to hold out for a higher amount to help the buyer out because they still have to look out for their best interest. They acted in commercial reasonableness regarding the trade, regarding the industry, regarding every aspect of the sale, and they acted in good faith, and this is the best they could do. That's fine. See? And you were worried. Now after this, we're going to go through damages. I believe, what do you know, it's the last thing on my list. So like I said, you could turn this easily into 20 steps. But I guess if I'm being honest, if you leave step 5 as 5A, B, and C, then technically there would only be 17 steps, depending on if you're a buyer or a seller. Step 16 is the remedy for the buyer or seller, and step 17 would be the type of damages that you're going to apply. So I apologize for miscounting. You know, I'm not a huge math person. I'm not awful at math, but I just don't consider it as much as I consider other things. So we have one more, and then we're done. And then I am going to have some chocolate cake left over for my lovely, lovely bridal shower. All right, let's get working.